So as I mentioned, a quick 5 minutes for the bathroom was 20 minutes. I'm sorry, the tech problem. We've switched the speakers. It should work smoothly from now. So we have a short 1 hour presentation compared to the hour and a half that we had before by Richard Dolan, who you see quite often on various television programs, the History Channel, Discovery, etc. And I've been recording at conferences for many years. A wonderful, interesting person who I am not going to introduce. I'm going to give you Peter Robbins to introduce Richard.
Jeffrey pretty much did introduce Richard. Thank you. Who I can only add is within our field thought of with the highest regard possible. There was nobody I would rather have by my side or having my back in this work. He is an esteemed colleague, a dear friend. Please give a very warm welcome for Richard M. Dolan.
Thank you, Bruce. Very happy to be here. I'll give a very brief background as to what I do. I have been maniacally researching the UFO subject for a little over 20 years. That's not as much as some of you, but it's a lot for me. I was working back in the olden times on a PhD in U.S. Cold War history. Back in the early 90s. Everything to do with Harry Truman and the Russians and everything else. And then I stumbled into this field. And my initial question was not to spend the next 20 years of my life researching it. It was simply one question, which was, is this actually part of our history? I wasn't even asking if aliens were real, or if there were such things as extraterrestrials. But I did become aware that there were claims that there was a cover-up, and that, as we've all heard. And I simply wanted to resolve for myself. I didn't want a big question mark hanging over my head for the rest of my life when I thought that I would be studying American history. I just wanted to know what this was about. And that was the beginning, and it just sucked me right in, because this is really the most fascinating subject that I can imagine. It, I think, encompasses the greatest mystery of our time and of our lives, the UFO subject. I'll explain why, hopefully, in this lecture. Someone just came up to me and was a little disappointed that I'm doing an introductory lecture, but I can assure you it'll be an interesting one, and we'll have a panel later, and we can get into anything you want to. I live and breathe this, as do all of these presenters. So that's basically it. I've only got 1 hour. I should go. The other thing I'll just mention is that I had a very serious computer mishap recently, and this is a new computer, and so I'm working off of it. This is a different little system. I think it should work just fine. So if there's any glitches, I apologize. What I would say with the UFO subject is that we have a discrepancy. And when you think about it, it's really true. I don't know if has anyone here had what they think is a UFO sighting? Would you be comfortable raising your hand? Quite a few. And I'll bet you if you haven't, then someone you know has, and they probably just haven't told you about it. It's a very widespread phenomenon, it turns out. UFO sightings are actually everywhere. In North America alone, every year, if you look at the two main websites that are responsible for UFOs, you'll be 13 to 15,000 sightings reported every year in U.S. and Canada. That's it, just those two countries. I'm not saying they're all landed alien craft. We don't know what they are because most do not get reported, but there's a lot being reported. And then on top of that, we're pretty certain that the vast majority of people who have sightings at all don't even report them anyway. So multiply this by 10. And we've got over 100,000 sightings a year. And then our job is to figure out how many of those are legitimate, and it gets messy. But the fact is there's a lot happening. We have almost no data for Europe. We have almost no data for South America, for Africa, Asia. There's a lot happening. They just don't have reporting infrastructure. So, but this is a global phenomenon, that we know. At the same time, and here's where the discrepancy comes in. It's happening everywhere. And also you find people are interested too, quietly interested. And yet it receives nothing but ridicule or non-attention from our official structure of power. And at the same time, as I've discovered, both personally and through research in archival documents, that the classified world, and I'll get into this quite a bit, has a strong interest in this subject. So it makes you wonder, as it made me wonder 22 years ago when I first dove in, if this is such a silly topic, why do we have one military document after another expressing extreme levels of interest in this subject? That's the question. Officially speaking, the United States government has not changed, not even one iota, over an entire human lifetime in their attitude about UFOs. So over here is a 1949 Air Force press release. I'm not going to go through all the language there. It's very bureaucratic anyway. You notice they get into bureaucratic language when they want to hide things and sound intelligent. Basically, they're saying, we have no evidence that UFOs are real. People misidentify things. There's a little bit of hysteria. And of course, there are hoaxers out there. And also crazy people. They call them psychopathological persons. Essentially, they're saying, there's some crazy people who think they see UFOs. That's 1949, before political correctness became a thing. So now in 2011, the White House, 5 years ago, made a different statement, a little more polished. Same basic position, though. We have no evidence that there's any life outside our planet, no evidence that there's any ETs here, and there's no, I love this part, no credible information to suggest that any evidence is being hidden from the public's eye. That's just 5 years ago from the Obama White House. So nothing has changed. As I was just saying, there are many, many sightings going on every year, even back in the old days of what was called Project Blue Book. That was in the 1950s and 60s. The U.S. Air Force had a little office staffed by like 3 people, usually, literally, who would be in charge of researching and investigating UFOs. Over about a 20-year period, they collected about 12,000 reports, most of which they tried assiduously to explain away. That was their mandate, in fact. But they still had 701 that were unexplained. But then you have thousands more back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s from private groups, a bunch of those. And then, as I was saying, today if you go online, you'll find 12 to 15,000 a year from 2 main websites. We don't know what's going on in the rest of the world, except we do get sightings. So it is everywhere. It's a global, massive phenomenon. And in fact, what I won't go into here, because there's not enough time in 60 minutes, but there's a very interesting case to be made for what we would call the ancient aliens or ancient astronauts hypothesis. I'm sure some of you have seen the show Ancient Aliens with our friend Giorgio with the hair. And in fact, I think that show has some interesting points in it and some other things that are maybe a little questionable. But there is, I think, a reasonable case that there's been something going on, like a hole in our ancient history that's not fully being explained. Wish I could get into more of it here. What we have in the ancient period is not really reports. There was no one doing investigations of UFOs, right? So there are stories that come down to us, and our problem is to interpret them. But some of them are quite interesting. But then what we have in the 20th century is a vast upsurge of sightings. And I think the reasons are several. One is that we ourselves were in the air in the 20th century, so we had better visibility. We had better perspective of seeing things. Actually, there were more of us as well. Our population kept going up. And then during the Second World War, we developed electronic means of detecting them, or other things like radar and so forth. And then we possessed other technology of interest, not just nuclear technology, which I mentioned here, but also we were really blowing up the whole electromagnetic spectrum on planet Earth in the mid-1940s and 50s. All of these, if there are other intelligences that can monitor us, they would know that in the middle of the 20th century, something very significant was happening to humanity, technologically speaking. And so, at least in theory, you might think that might spur greater interest, I think, and I do believe that's the case. One case that I found this one in the Canadian archives, so I love talking about it for that reason. This is a place called Aylmer Lake, and you can see how north this is. Maybe you can't even tell. That's way, way north in Canada. No one can live up in this place. A number of years ago, I was going through archives in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you were a Canadian citizen and you saw what you thought was a UFO, you could write to the government, and they would take that report, put it in a little file, and the scientists in the white coats would just run away from it and never read it, but the report would be there, and now you can go there and read them. And this was written by a man who was elderly in the 1980s, and all he said was, when I was a young man, I was 25 years old in 1936, I just want to record for posterity's sake what happened to me. So this guy had the coolest job in the world at age 25. He had, the Canadian government hired a number of people to do aerial mapping surveys of the country. You can imagine, in 1936, aircraft was just advanced enough, and photography was advanced enough, that you could go into this vast north area of Canada and get accurate mapping to survey the area. So that was what they were doing. And this guy's job, he had one of those pontoon planes that could land on the water, because there's countless lakes, virtually infinite amounts of lakes up there. So he's at a place called Islemer Lake. And to this day, no one can live there. You can get great fishing if you're hardy and go up there in the summertime. So he's there, and nothing for hundreds of miles around him. And he said, I was doing a pre-flight check, and I just looked straight up for whatever reason. And he said, directly above me was, in his words, the most perfect configuration of an airship one could imagine. It was slightly elongated, crystal clear blue sky, no clouds. It was elongated, going north-south orientation, just there. And he said, I couldn't figure out how large it was because there were no clouds, there was no point of reference, but I feel it was fairly large in size. No reflection, gunmetal gray, no markings of any sort. It was just there. And then he said in an instant it went from north-south to an east-west, so it like rotated very quickly, and then instantly accelerated. He said, no sound, just instant acceleration off to the east, gone in like a moment. He left, he submitted his military records to the Canadian government just so they could see who he was. His handwriting was impeccable, his language was perfect. I wasn't there with him in 1936, but I believe his story. I think he was truthful. It's just one of many of these inexplicable early stories. And what's going to be up there in the middle of nowhere in Canada in 1936 doing that? And why would it be there when he was there is another interesting question to ask. There's a lot of these cases where people are in these remote regions and then they have this encounter with something that's just there, like just by coincidence. I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, this is where he was, and he had this encounter. During the Second World War is when this phenomenon really takes off with what were called Foo Fighters. the universe scientific study of UFOs. The attitude was, we'll just let the scientists look at it. They'll decide, and if they decide it's not legitimate, we're going to drop UFOs. But if they decide it is legitimate, we'll ramp up our study of it, supposedly. So what we know is that the Condon Committee, as it was called, that's Edward Condon, who headed the Colorado study, was as much of a rigged game as anything that you can imagine. Condon went into it stating to his colleagues that this is, he said, if we were to come to a positive conclusion on this, I would not tell the public. I would take those conclusions in a locked briefcase to the president, but the public's not going to know. This is what one of the top scientists stated later. There was such an anti-UFO bias in this committee that there was a mutiny midway through, and all of the dissenting scientists were fired. New scientists were brought in. Condon writes his conclusion, which is essentially that there's nothing to UFOs. They offer no probative value to science. In other words, if we study them, we're really not going to learn anything. So he recommended the Air Force just drop their Project Blue Book, despite the fact that within the Condon Committee there was a tremendous number of unexplained cases. There was a memo in the early part of that committee when they were just getting started. This is Condon's number 2 guy, Robert Lowe, who was himself a former intelligence officer. He said, here's how we have to do this project. The trick would be, we want to describe it so that to the public it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. In other words, he's saying, if we're going to do this project, we really don't want the world, the scientific community, to think that we're going to be going into this as believers. And indeed, they certainly did not. Oh, okay, that's not good. How did this happen? Excuse me. Let's try this again. My apologies.
So the Condon report put a condom on a society pregnant with ideas of the other.
I guess you could say that. All right, so here we go. Okay, good. At least we'll go here. Sorry. So as a result, this is all 1969, 1970s, all ancient history, you think, but it's relevant for today. What the Air Force did is that they closed Project Blue Book, which was really kind of a joke of an investigative body. It's true. But what I would say is, yes, Blue Book pretended to investigate UFOs, and they didn't. They really debunked UFOs, yes. They were a joke, but they were our joke. And what I mean is that we taxpayers paid for them. And so that, at least in theory, they were responsible to the public. When Blue Book was closed down, if you had a UFO sighting, you really couldn't go to the government anymore. And I feel that's important because, the government's supposed to be they're supposed to be working for us. And if you've got this important thing happening in our world, one would think we would want our government to know what's happening and to be responsive to us about it. And with the closure of Project Blue Book, all of that ended. For the military, it didn't really matter because, as we know here from a statement that just came out right after Blue Book closed, one general said, well, any reports of UFOs that affect national security are not even part of the Blue Book system. We do those through other channels. So in other words, Blue Book was totally just public relations anyway. The only thing that happened is that the public got locked out of UFOs. What no one expected, though, was after the closure of Blue Book, something else occurred for us, for we the people, and that was an expansion of the Freedom of Information Act by the late 70s. This is after Watergate, after Vietnam. The country was in a certain mood in the late 70s, and that mood was probably the most politically liberal mood of the late 20th century. And the Freedom of Information Act was greatly strengthened. And what that meant was you, as a citizen, could petition your government for documents and all kinds of things that were never available before. You could shake the tree and documents would fall out, as it were. And there were UFO researchers who got thousands of pages of documents relating to UFOs at this time. It was a shock. No one expected this. These documents, which had formerly been classified, were now being declassified because President Jimmy Carter encouraged a liberal interpretation of freedom of information. It was radically undercut in the early 80s, under the Reagan years, but we still have FOIA, of course, and it's still useful. But I think the glory era was the late 70s, frankly, when we got a lot of information. And I should have put a map on there for you. But well known if you're a UFO researcher. Basically, there were American base there, American personnel encountered on multiple nights the what certainly was a landed craft. It certainly was on another night a craft that was beaming a laser-like light down to the weapons storage area of that base, where to this day it's not acknowledged, but nuclear weapons were being stored there. And it was, in the words of Colonel Charles Halt, to Peter Robbins and to Larry Warren, who interviewed him, adversely affected the ordnance, that beam of light. I'm almost wrapping this up. How am I doing with time, by the way? I have no idea. So to get in their crosshairs and say, oh yeah, that's a hoax or that's a mistake. Some of these arguments, when you really get into them, are threadbare at best. The claim that this is a hoax, supposedly, and I've never seen a statement by this man, but supposedly he said years later, oh yeah, I hoaxed it for a little bit of money. How? Why? You know, I mean, and then the statement just goes away. So now that photograph is damaged as evidence forever, and I don't know what the story is. What I do know is that there were hundreds of confirmed sightings of a perfect triangular craft over Belgium for months. Police officers, civilians, military people, silent, acting in every way like a standard UFO, except it was a perfect triangle, and maneuvering away. And then on the night of March 30th, 31st, thousands of witnesses seeing this object flying over the skies, 2 F-16s trying to intercept, tracking it on radar. At one point, this object dropped about 1 mile, ultra slow speeds, ultra fast speeds. What is this thing? The Belgian Air Force went on the news media and said there was a logic in the movements of the UFO. He ruled out, he said it's too fast and too slow to be an aircraft, speeds greater than the sound barrier, no bang recorded, however, no explanation can be given. Back in those days, the US news media had just learned of the stealth fighter, which is kind of angular, as you know, and so they put out the explanation, well, maybe it was a testing of a stealth plane. But this is no stealth fighter. Clearly, the stealth fighter doesn't have this kind of maneuverability, not even close. Oh yes, the Moscow case. As the Soviet Union was breaking apart in these last few years, it was a very interesting time because, the Soviet press was wide open for several years at the very end of the Soviet Union. And people were reporting some amazing UFOs. This is a military case, another one. And I don't know how much detail I should go into. It was a case where this object was being chased by a Soviet fighter pilot, who then found that he was being chased by the object. Like, how did this happen? But and what's interesting is that it was confirmed by the 2 very high-level officials, the Deputy Minister of Defense, Ivan Tretyak, and then the Chief of Soviet Air Defense Forces, General Igor Maltsev, who said several radar stations, over 100 visuals by military, 2 photographs, where are they? I haven't seen them, able to perform S-turn horizontally and vertically. So it's able to do this, and it's able to do this. Hover, and then move far faster than a jet fighter. And oh yes, it was silent. So, and what he says, is, I love this statement, he says, well, whoever they are, they have somehow come to terms with gravity. At the present time, terrestrial machines could hardly have such capabilities. You know, and it's funny, in the Western press, when they would get these types of statements, they would say, well, it's Soviet propaganda. No evidence that this is whatsoever. I don't know. This is just the knee-jerk American response to these types of things. They do it today as well in Russia. But they were doing it in 1990. Area 51, something was being built out there. It's Area 51 out in Nevada, of course. After Bob Lazar goes public, and says, yes, I worked at that facility, and we were reverse engineering alien craft, and we were making. And one thing Lazar did, see, people think he's totally fake. I really have to question this, because Lazar stated, he said, well, if you want to go see the tests, you know, he said exactly where to look and when to go. And indeed, so a lot of people started going out there with their lounge chairs and just would hang out with some beer and their cameras, and they'd wait. And one guy, Gary Schultz, took a very good photograph of one of the objects, kind of a hat-shaped thing. This is February 1990. There were a lot of people at that time. Shortly after this, some very interesting video leaked out of Nellis testing range, not far from Area 51, leaked to the TV show Hard Copy. You can find the video of this on YouTube. It's very interesting. What you find is it was on classified Air Force grounds, and the Air Force operators looking at this through their screen are wondering, what is that? You can hear them asking this. Is it a helicopter? They couldn't tell what this was. It's maneuvering, and what's interesting is that there's data on the screen that can allow you the opportunity of gauging its altitude and speed. I'm about to sneeze.
Bless you.
Thank you. I usually sneeze in 4s, so you got lucky. So anyway, the analysis of this has been done twice by people, at least that I'm aware of. Martin Powell and Dave Rudiak both say this object was about 15 feet across, about 10 feet high. 18 to 20 miles per hour, as fast as 500, all within like a couple of minutes. It did a right angle turn at 140 miles per hour, and it seemed to shape shift to some extent. What is this? Did we make this? If I were going to give the other lecture that I nearly gave, my strong feeling is that the scenario is these sightings are real, obviously. The military is concerned. They've recovered technology. They're trying to reverse engineer the technology. They're trying to essentially duplicate what they're seeing. I think they're making various levels of success, maybe not total. And that this is ultra, ultra secret for obvious reasons. Because whatever is powering these things, it's not just petroleum. So whatever is allowing us to go from point A to point B instantly, it's better than what we're using now. And that implies a complete transformation of our global petroleum-based infrastructure, which means a transformation of the whole global financial structure, because the United States dominates the world on what is called the petrodollar system. Too much to go into here, but that's what it is. Right. And so to reveal the full truth of this phenomenon scientifically, in my view anyway, means a rapid end to the petroleum-based infrastructure of this world, which is a global revolution, something less than that. And so that alone, there are other reasons, but that alone is enough for the power structure that dominates every government, including the US government. Financial, petroleum-based power structure essentially is like, we're going to hang on to this as long as possible. And we're not giving this up. That's because right. It's too revolutionary. So I think the Nellis video, my feeling is that we made that, whatever that is. I think we're testing it. And what's interesting is this is now 22 years ago, and it's still not officially acknowledged. We have unbelievable levels of secrecy. It's like, I grew up with the old Cold War as a kid, and I had the same propaganda that everyone else had in America. Oh, America is on the side of freedom. I love America, but what has happened is that it's like in that movie Alien, where the guy has the alien come out of his chest. That's what's happened to us. So like we've had this foreign thing grow inside of us. It's the national security state, the homeland security state, and it comes out of us, and the original body is now dead, as far as I can see, and something new now has transformed us into all of the bad things that we accused the other guys of being in the old days, we're now doing, and more. This phenomenon of UFOs is not just ancient times, 1940s. It's going through our century in great amounts. That's a young me with nice dark hair. And if you look carefully, you can see a little bit of hope in my eyes, right on it. It's there, I know it's there. Back in olden time. So that's in 2002, this is after 9/11, there were another sighting over the or right near the Capitol, right outside of the restricted airspace. F-16s were chasing after this object. At one point, it descended from the sky at an 80-degree angle and stopped. Jets came after it and then just instantly accelerated away, according to one witness that I interviewed. This made the Washington Post, it made a lot of the local news, and then just died. One Air Force spokesperson did say anonymously that they tracked it on radar and it just disappeared. That's interesting. And then the Air Force rep also said, I love this, well, it could have been any number of things. And I'm like, really? I'd like to know what those things could be. There's a blue object being chased and outperforming F-16 interceptors over nearly restricted airspace post 9/11 America. Yeah, I'd like to know what that could be. He didn't get into that, obviously. And then, you know, the Washington Post, would they possibly ask a follow-up question? No, of course not. So that witness is a retired police officer, DC police officer named Gary Dillman. I love that guy. He was doing a night security detail, and he got a very clear view of the events. Over O'Hare Airport, that's an early version of my bearded look. In 2006, this is one of the busiest airports in the world, of course. A craft was seen over that airport for 15 minutes. United employees were told, do not report this. One of them did to the National UFO Reporting Center, and then it just kind of got out. The object hovered for about 15 minutes and then instantly accelerated and punched a hole through the cloud. That was visible for some time. Many witnesses to this. And again, what's over O'Hare Airport, just hovering there? That's a serious air traffic control issue over that very busy airport. This is a recreation. I actually made this recreation. This is not a real photograph. But Stephenville, Texas in 2008 did have an object that was said to be this relative size to our jets. And it came in. It was being chased by jets. Air Force originally denied it, but then they admitted they had jets in the area. There's been radar tracking that was released by MUFON, which looks like they were tracking UFOs. It's kind of tough to interpret, but it certainly looks like you have a lot of witnesses describing this gargantuan object come in and then hover. There are witnesses who stated they got a very clear view of the underside, and it took off. It made massive acceleration. And then this is a case that I investigated. I wrote about in my most recent book, which I don't have here, unfortunately, but is available. CFS Alert is the most northern human habitation on the planet. That's where the circle is. If you look, it's pretty far north. It's a Canadian base. If you go right to the tip of Greenland and make a quick left, boom, you're there. That's what it looks like. Imagine being stationed there for a year. So I know a gentleman who was stationed there. And the same month of the Stephenville case, in January of 2008, not that long ago, there's about 50 guys that operate this base. But they do electronic espionage on Russia, and they also are in communication with nuclear submarines that are in the area. So it's a low-level base at this point. So in the Arctic winter, it's pitch black 24/7. So it was dark all day long. So he's in the cafeteria getting lunch, and there's a huge window like the size of the wall, right? And he said suddenly it was brighter than daylight out the window for about 10 minutes. And he thought originally, oh, we must have had floodlights. Someone must have turned them on. And then the lights went off. About a half hour later, 20 minutes later, about 10 or 15 of the base personnel come in. They've been out on a hike just to get some exercise. They come in and they're just in a state of shock. So my witness spoke to enough of them, several of them, and they said there was an object that came up over the base, about 200 feet long, cigar-shaped, had stopped over the base, shone this intensely bright light on the base for about 10 minutes, and then moved off over the Arctic Ocean and just was gone. Over the frozen Arctic Ocean.
Wow.
Now, I had a long conversation with this man about the aircraft that could possibly do this, drones, anything, helicopters. There's just nothing. The range on such an object would be off the charts. The nearest base is 400 miles to the south an American base called Thule Air Base. They do have helicopters, but they don't fly them in the winter. And it would be a suicide mission to do that in the Arctic winter at night. And for what? And then to hang out over the Canadian base for whatever reason, then to go off over the Arctic Ocean. None of it makes sense. There's nothing up there. But something was there. There's more follow-up to that story, but I'm running out of time. I'll just summarize. So this is my introductory lecture. I hope it was interesting. I would say there's an overwhelming amount of documented interest by militaries, not simply the US military. I skipped over Britain, France, Australia. They've all got these cases. I talked a little bit about some of the Russian cases, but it's everywhere of military interest in these UFOs. Something important is going on. Some of this relationship appears, at least to me, to be confrontational. I'm not saying hostile. I'm not saying we're trying to shoot them out of the sky, but there seems to be some kind of issue going on where they are doing things that our militaries are not in control of and would like to be in control of, but they're not. So there's a tremendous amount of secrecy about this. At the very least, if you go back home and you talk to your uncle or your cousin who's a total skeptic and wants to laugh at you about UFOs, just say, hey, you know what? There's surprisingly, a shockingly high amount of evidence, at least to show, not that these are aliens from another planet necessarily, although who knows, but at least to show that this is something that is being taken seriously, that it shows technology that is not supposed to exist, but appears to exist by agencies unknown that seem to be taking our world somewhat seriously. So that's my website. You can check it out if you're interested, and I want to thank you for your time.
We're not doing Q&A because the speakers will be at their tables, and you can do that there. Please take the next time period. Now, we're not quite 1:30.
Okay.
We're going to start, Peter.
I'm gonna
Should all the
try
tech
to,
things work out, we don't have to make another
speak with-
switch and maybe grab Nathan or
I'll
Larry.
do a different lecture.
You know, and tomorrow we'll start at, and we'll go for the whole weekend. So I want to start at 2:15 back here. That gives us 45 minutes for the restaurant to hit the speakers. I'd like everybody to walk in the back and walk around the booths and see who's here and thank them for joining us, whether you pick something up from them or not. So please, Peter, Richard's booth are outside. Also Nathan is outside. Laird is in the back with the other booths that we have. Please come browse. See you at 2:15.
I'm actually going to go see if Richard needs any help over there. And hopefully I'm going to get a couple of minutes with him later to ask him a couple of questions. So I apologize for the audio issues and video issues. It's about the streaming, and I'm getting pounded with so many messages and questions. So sometimes the stream was bouncing in and out, but you got to get a little glimpse of Richard Dolan's presentation. And we'll be back in a little while to see Peter Robbins do his presentation. It's going to be on Secretary Forrestal, as I interviewed him a little bit earlier. So I'm going to stop streaming right now, charge my phone, and see if I can find some time to get Richard on the side. He did agree to do so. So we'll be back, and I'll be back with Richard and Peter and everybody else. All right, so let me, I'm going to just keep it going. So let's just see what's going to happen here. So, all right, so I'm going to stop for now. I'll be back.